Close your eyes, just for a moment. Imagine a small village of mud huts on the bank of a muddy river. Listen. Can you hear the murmur of a new language, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the bleating of sheep? This is Rome, a tiny, insignificant seed of a place surrounded by stronger, older cultures. A place with no right to survive, let alone conquer. Now, let the centuries sweep by like a fast-moving river. Feel the village swell into a town, then a city, then the heart of a republic. The murmur becomes the roar of the forum. The clang of the hammer becomes the rhythmic clash of legions' swords. The scent of wood smoke gives way to the aroma of spices from distant Egypt and the incense of 1,000 temples. Feel the power, the sheer, world-spanning weight of an empire that stretched from the mists of Scotland to the sands of Mesopotamia. An empire that built roads so straight they seemed to defy geography, and laws so profound they still echo in our courtrooms today. For 1,000 years, this empire was the world. But now, feel the shift, a subtle tremor of decay. The foundations begin to crack, the borders fray. The magnificent machine begins to grind to a halt, collapsing under its own immense weight. The light begins to fade. Open your eyes. The story of Rome is more than a tale of emperors and armies. It is the story of us. It is the archetypal story of how great civilizations are born, how they reach for eternity, and how, inevitably, they fall apart. It is a story of a ghost that still haunts our world today. And our story begins, as all great stories do, not with certainty, but with a myth. Every great empire needs a creation myth. For Apple, it's the suburban garage. For Facebook, the Harvard dorm room. For Rome, it was a blood-soaked riverbank and a pair of divinely sired twins suckled by a she-wolf. The story of Romulus and Remus, steeped in violence, ambition, and divine favor, is more than a quaint legend. It's a mission statement. It's the foundational prospectus for a venture that would, against all odds, scale from a cluster of mud huts into the most powerful and enduring empire the world had ever known. We treat it as folklore, but the Romans treated it as destiny, a narrative that justified a relentless, centuries-long project of aggressive expansion. If we strip away the myth and look at the historical reality, Rome in its infancy was less a divinely ordained city and more a precarious startup. Situated on the Tiber, surrounded by older, more powerful cultures, the sophisticated Etruscans to the north, the fractious Latin tribes nearby, and the formidable Samnite hill peoples to the southeast, its survival was anything but guaranteed. The early Roman Republic was a company playing in a brutal, hyper-competitive market where a single lost war, a single failed product launch could lead to total liquidation. Every decision was existential. Every war was a high-risk investment round, funded not with capital, but with the blood and land of its citizens. A victory meant acquiring critical assets, fertile land, strategic river crossings, and, most importantly, human capital. A loss meant facing annihilation. This constant existential pressure forged a culture of extreme pragmatism, ruthless efficiency, and an almost religious devotion to the state's survival, the perfect incubator for an imperial business model. Other city-states and kingdoms of the era conquered. They would defeat an enemy, plunder their city and leave with treasure and slaves. This was the equivalent of a corporate raid, a short-term extraction of value. Rome's genius was to invent a different model, not just conquest, but acquisition and integration. They developed a scalable system for turning defeated enemies into future assets, creating a self-fueling engine of expansion that was their true killer app. This model rested on three core pillars. First was scalable conquest. Roman strategy was built around the legion, a fighting force that was not just a weapon, but a mobile engineering and colonization firm. When a legion defeated an enemy, its work was just beginning. It built roads to connect the new territory back to the capital, established fortified colonies, coloniae, to act as permanent garrisons and outposts of Roman culture, and surveyed the captured land for distribution to Roman citizens. This methodical approach ensured that conquered territory didn't just become a temporary prize, but was permanently hardwired into the growing Roman network. The roads, in particular, were the physical manifestation of this strategy, the arteries of empire that allowed for the rapid movement of troops, goods, and information, binding the disparate parts into a coherent whole. Second, and most critically, was a revolutionary tiered integration strategy. Unlike other conquerors who offered a binary choice between freedom and subjugation, Rome created a nuanced hierarchy of belonging. This was a form of political alchemy. Upon defeat, a city was not always punished. It was given a contract, an offer to join the Roman system. At the top were the cives Romani, full Roman citizens with the right to vote and hold office. Below them were communities granted ius latii, Latin rights, a kind of Class B stock that conferred most of the private rights of a citizen, like trade and marriage, and, crucially, a pathway for their local magistrates to eventually gain full citizenship. At the bottom were the soci, the allies, who remained self-governing but lost their foreign policy independence and were obligated to provide troops for Rome's wars. This system was a masterstroke of social engineering. It institutionalized ambition. For a local elite in a conquered town, the path of continued suicidal resistance was bleak. But the Roman offer provided a clear ladder to climb. By cooperating, by contributing to the Roman war machine, by adopting Roman customs, you and your city could gradually ascend the ranks. The dream of full citizenship, with all its protections and privileges, was a powerful incentive that channeled the ambitions of conquered peoples towards supporting the Roman project, rather than undermining it. It gave them skin in the game. This leads to the third pillar, manpower leveraging. The price of peace for a conquered city was a treaty that always contained the same clause. You will provide a levy of soldiers to serve alongside the legions. This was the network effect that made Rome unstoppable. Each new acquisition didn't just add territory, it added new cohorts to the army. The Samnites, after being brutally defeated, were forced to provide some of the best auxiliary troops for Rome's subsequent campaigns against the Greek king Pyrrhus. The resources of former enemies were immediately repurposed to fuel the next phase of expansion. The more Rome conquered, the larger its armies became, allowing it to wage multiple wars on multiple fronts, a capability no other power in Italy could match. Rome turned the entire Italian peninsula into its own military recruitment pool. To understand how this model felt on the ground, imagine you are Lucius, the young son of a Samnite nobleman in the city of Bovianum in 290 BCE. For over 50 years, your people have fought the Romans in 3 savage wars. You were raised on stories of Samnite victories, of Roman legions humiliated at the Caudine Forks. Your father and 2 uncles died fighting the relentless advance of the legions. Your heart burns with a bitter patriotic hatred. Then the inevitable happens. The legions of Consul Manius Curius Dentatus finally crush the last Samnite resistance. Your city is spared the torch, but the terms of surrender are read in the forum. A Roman magistrate, a man with a cold, patrician confidence, outlines the treaty. Your city will keep its local laws and elect its own officials. Your family will retain its land. But your foreign policy now belongs to Rome. A Roman prefect will be installed. And, most galling of all, your city must raise and equip 2 cohorts of soldiers to be placed at the disposal of the Roman consuls. That night, your cousin, Marcus, his face a mask of rage, gathers the young nobles in a secret meeting. He speaks of honor, of dying for a free Samnium, of a final, glorious uprising. Better to die on our feet than live on our knees, he spits. A few years ago, you would have been the first to draw your sword. But now you hesitate. You saw the Roman siege engines. You saw the discipline of the legionaries as they methodically butchered your city's phalanx. You see the new paved road they are already building, a straight line of gravel and stone pointing directly toward your home, an arrow aimed at the heart of your lands. A rebellion, you realize, isn't glorious. It is suicide. It means your family's lands will be confiscated, your surviving relatives sold into slavery, and your city's name erased from the earth. The next day, the Roman magistrate summons the leading families. He speaks not of punishment, but of opportunity. He speaks of the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods that Rome brings. He outlines the Treaty of Alliance, framing it as a partnership. He notes that your family, as local leaders, can ensure a smooth transition. There is a clear, if unstated, promise. Serve Rome well, and Rome will reward you. Your path to power is no longer in a shrinking Samnium, but within a growing Rome. He offers you a choice, oblivion or a future. With a heavy heart, you turn your back on your cousin's doomed plot. You choose the future. You accept the Roman merger. 20 years later, you stand on a dusty parade ground. You're older now, a respected magistrate in a city that is more prosperous than ever before, trading its wool and grain along Roman roads that connect you to the entire peninsula. Beside you stands your son, Gaius, wearing the armor of a Roman auxiliary officer. He is not being forced. He is a proud commander, fluent in Latin as well as his native Oscan. His legion is marching south to fight Pyrrhus and his war elephants, a foreign invader. The irony does not escape you. Your son, the grandson of a man who died fighting Rome, is now risking his life to defend it. He is no longer just a Samnite. He is a vital part of the Roman system. Your family's investment in the Roman enterprise is beginning to pay dividends. You have, against every instinct of your youth, bought into the dream. This was the quiet, grinding process, repeated in hundreds of towns across Italy, that built the Roman Republic. It was a conquest of arms, but more profoundly, a conquest of ambition. By the time Rome faced its great rival, Carthage, it wasn't a city-state fighting a maritime empire. It was a unified peninsula, a coalition of peoples bound by treaties, self-interest, and a shared military destiny, all directed from a single, ruthless, and visionary center. The startup had achieved a monopoly, and it was now ready to take its business model global. In the summer of 216 BCE, on a dusty plain near the village of Cannae, the Roman Republic effectively died. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had crossed the Alps with an army and a burning grudge, executed what is still regarded as the most perfect tactical victory in military history. By day's end, as many as 50,000 Roman soldiers, the sons of senators, farmers, and allies, lay dead or dying, their bodies forming a ghastly, miles-long testament to Carthaginian brilliance. It was a blow from which no other ancient state could have recovered. By all logic, Rome should have sued for peace, its will broken, its allies defecting, its very existence forfeit. And yet, it did not. The gates of the city did not open. The allies, for the most part, did not abandon their treaties. Within months, new legions were being levied, composed of veterans, teenagers, and even freed slaves. Rome absorbed a blow that would have shattered any contemporary power, and then, over the next decade, methodically ground out a victory. How? The answer has little to do with abstract virtues like Roman fortitude and everything to do with the state's core machinery. If the Roman Republic was a world-conquering enterprise, its success was built on two proprietary technologies, two integrated systems that made it more resilient, adaptable, and scalable than any rival. The first was its hardware, the legion, an institution that was far more than a mere fighting force. The second, and arguably more important, was its operating system, Roman law, a code that could conquer and integrate societies far more permanently than any sword. Together, these two apps allowed Rome not just to win wars, but to convert the chaos of conquest into the enduring structure of empire. The hardware, the legion as a system builder. To picture a Roman legionary as simply a superior warrior is to miss the point entirely. His true power lay not in his sword arm, but in the vast, disciplined organization to which he belonged. The legion was the hardware of the Roman enterprise, a brutally efficient tool for violence, yes, but also a mobile engineering firm and a powerful social engine for manufacturing Roman identity. The legion's engineering prowess was legendary and central to its function. A Roman army on the march was a force of relentless order. At the end of every single day, no matter how long the march or how hostile the territory, the soldiers would build a fully fortified camp, castra, complete with a palisade, a deep ditch, and a perfectly gridded street plan. This was not merely defensive. It was a profound psychological statement. Every night, in the heart of a wild and hostile land, a miniature, orderly Rome would rise from the earth, a beacon of discipline and inevitability. For the Gallic or Germanic tribes watching from the hills, the message was clear. These people do not just raid, they remain. They bring their system with them. This engineering capacity went far beyond temporary camps. The legions were the primary instrument of infrastructure policy. They built the famous Roman roads, straight and durable arteries of stone that were designed for the rapid movement of troops, but soon became the lifeblood of commerce. They erected massive bridges, like Caesar's famous Rhine crossing, built in a mere 10 days to demonstrate that no natural barrier could impede Roman will. They surveyed land, drained swamps, and constructed the aqueducts that would become the hallmark of Roman urbanism. This infrastructure was not a byproduct of conquest. It was the mechanism of it. It physically hardwired new territories into the Roman network, making them easier to control, supply, and ultimately assimilate. Simultaneously, the army served as the empire's most effective social engine. During the late Republic and early Empire, the legions were not just for citizens. The bulk of the cavalry and specialized infantry were auxiliaries, recruited from the very provinces Rome had conquered. For a young man from Gaul, Spain, or Thrace, enlisting was a life-altering decision. It offered steady pay, professional training, and the opportunity to see the world. But the ultimate prize came after 25 years of loyal service. A grant of land, a pension, and, most precious of all, full Roman citizenship for himself and his descendants. This was a transformative policy. The army became the single most important institution for turning provincials into Romans. In the barracks, a Thracian archer would learn Latin to communicate with his centurion. He would fight alongside a Gallic cavalryman to defend a border in Syria. He would absorb Roman military discipline and customs. By the end of his service, he was no longer just a member of his tribe. He was part of a pan-imperial brotherhood, his identity forged in service to the state. The legions didn't just defeat barbarians, they actively recruited them and, over a generation, turned them into Romans. The operating system, law as the code of empire. If the legions were the hardware that physically built the empire, Roman law was the open architecture operating system that ran it. While the sight of a legion might inspire fear, it was the unseen code of the law that truly integrated millions of diverse people into a single functional society. Rome's legal revolution was its emphasis on system, predictability, and portability. Early legal codes were often tribal, divine, or tied to a specific place. Roman law, by contrast, evolved to become an abstract framework capable of governing a cosmopolitan empire. Its most crucial innovation was the ius gentium, or law of nations. As Rome's influence expanded beyond Italy, its magistrates were confronted with a practical problem: how to adjudicate disputes between a Roman citizen and a non-citizen, peregrinus, or between two non-citizens from different parts of the world. The existing Roman civil law, ius civile, applied only to citizens. The solution was a stroke of pragmatic genius. Roman jurists developed a body of law based on what they deemed to be the shared commercial practices and principles of natural reason common to all peoples. This ius gentium governed contracts, property disputes, and commercial relationships across the Mediterranean. It meant a merchant from Alexandria could sign a shipping contract with a tin producer in Spain, confident that if a dispute arose, a Roman governor in either province would apply a predictable set of legal principles to resolve it. This created a stable, unified economic zone, encouraging trade and long-term investment by reducing risk. It was the legal software that allowed the economy of the Mediterranean to run on the Roman platform. This predictability was a powerful force for integration. For provincial elites, mastering the complexities of Roman law became essential for maintaining their status and managing their cities. They sent their sons to study rhetoric and law in schools modeled on those in Rome. By adopting Roman legal procedures and norms, they brought their local administrations into alignment with the imperial center, often without a Roman soldier in sight. The law was a far more subtle and cost-effective tool of control than a garrison. It conquered society by making the Roman way the most logical and profitable way to conduct one's affairs. Case study: the Punic Wars as a clash of systems. Nowhere is the superiority of the Roman system clearer than in its epic, century-long struggle with Carthage. The conflict is traditionally cast as a duel between heroic generals, the brilliant Hannibal versus the patient Fabius and the bold Scipio. But it was fundamentally a clash of two different imperial models, and Hannibal's ultimate failure reveals the fatal flaw in the Carthaginian system. Carthage was a great maritime power, a hub-and-spoke empire built on trade. Its power projected from its magnificent harbor, enforced by a dominant navy, and extended through a network of coastal trading posts and client states. It was immensely wealthy, but its empire was a transactional one. Its subjects in North Africa and Spain were tributaries who paid taxes. Its armies were largely composed of mercenaries, Numidian cavalry, Gallic infantry, Balearic slingers, paid professionals who fought for Carthaginian gold, not Carthaginian ideals. Its subjects had no path to becoming Carthaginian. They were customers and suppliers, not partners. Hannibal's invasion of Italy was the ultimate stress test on the Roman model. He was a strategic genius who, with his professional mercenary army, consistently outmaneuvered and destroyed the citizen levies Rome sent against him. After Cannae, he expected the pillars of the Roman Confederation to crumble. He believed Rome's Italian allies, oppressed and resentful, would flock to his banner. A few did, but the great majority did not. Why? Because for all their grievances, the Italian socii were part of the Roman system. They had been integrated, not just subjugated. For generations, they had served in Roman armies, traded on Roman roads, and benefited from the stability Rome provided. Their treaties offered them a long-term future, a pathway to greater integration and eventual citizenship. Hannibal, for all his genius, could only offer them the short-term prospect of plunder and a return to the internecine warfare that had plagued Italy before Rome's rise. Most Allied cities made a pragmatic calculation. A wounded Rome was a better long-term partner than a victorious Carthaginian. Rome's systemic depth provided the resilience Carthage lacked. When Rome lost 50,000 men, its system of alliances and citizen levies allowed it to raise another 50,000. It drew on a deep, motivated pool of manpower that was fighting for its own homes and its own future. When Carthage lost an army, it had to reach into its treasury and hire a new one. When Scipio took the war to North Africa, Carthage's subjects, who felt no loyalty to the city that ruled them, quickly switched sides. Hannibal was recalled to defend his home, not because of a tactical blunder, but because the foundation of his empire was hollow. Hannibal won the battles, but Rome's system won the war. The final confrontation at Zama was merely the bloody conclusion to a long, grinding audit of two competing enterprises. One was a wealthy trading house with hired guards. The other was a vast, integrated partnership. In the end, the partnership proved stronger. The conquest of the Mediterranean, therefore, was not a simple military achievement. It was the successful scaling of this dual system. The legions were the unstoppable hardware that shattered and acquired rival systems, but it was the sophisticated legal and political code, the promise of partnership, the predictability of law, the path to citizenship, that allowed Rome to absorb its conquests and grow stronger from them. Rome had created a system so robust and compelling that it could withstand even the most catastrophic of defeats, a system that would long outlast the legions themselves. The great challenge, however, was yet to come. What happens when a machine built for relentless expansion finally runs out of world to conquer? There is a gilded, almost mythical image of the Roman Empire at its height. It is the era of the Pax Romana, the 2 centuries of relative peace that followed Augustus's consolidation of power. It's an image of magnificent cities, Ephesus, Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome itself, adorned with marble temples, teeming forums, and colossal amphitheaters. It's the image of aqueducts marching across the landscape, of ships laden with Egyptian grain and Spanish silver plying the safe waters of the Mediterranean, and of a single unifying law providing order for tens of millions from the misty hills of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria. The Greek orator Aelius Aristides, speaking in the 2nd century CE, captured this feeling of awe. Neither sea nor intervening continent bars citizenship. Everything is open to everybody. This was the brilliant facade of the Roman peace, and it was in many ways real. For the privileged elite at the empire's core, it was an age of unprecedented security, prosperity, and cultural exchange. But this peace was a paradox. It was not a gentle absence of conflict, but a state of equilibrium bought at a tremendous price, paid by others. The stability of the center was enabled by constant violence on the periphery. The wealth of the aristocracy was extracted from the provinces and built on the backs of millions of slaves. The Pax Romana was not a golden age of universal harmony. It was a complex, brittle system whose very success created the deep structural flaws that would, in time, trigger its near collapse. It was a magnificent edifice built over a cracking foundation. The engine of inequality. The term Roman peace is itself a masterpiece of political branding. It was not an era free from war. It was an era in which the Roman state achieved a near total monopoly on organized violence. While civil wars among Roman legions ceased for a time, the legions themselves were perpetually at war. On the frontiers, they engaged in brutal, near-constant campaigns to pacify, defend, or expand. The peace that a senator enjoyed in his Roman villa was underwritten by the unceasing violence of soldiers fighting and dying in the forests of Germany, the highlands of Scotland, or the deserts of Parthia. The peace was for the core, and it was paid for with the blood of soldiers and the subjugation of barbarians. This geographic transfer of violence was matched by a massive economic transfer of wealth. The splendor of the capital city, its grand public works, its free entertainment, and, most importantly, the grain dole, annona, that fed hundreds of thousands of its unemployed citizens, was fueled by a relentless extraction of resources from the provinces. Egypt was not so much a province as the personal breadbasket of Rome. Its immense agricultural surplus requisitioned annually to prevent starvation and riots in the capital. The rich mines of Spain and Dacia were stripped of their gold and silver to fill the imperial treasury and pay the legions. Provincial governors, often seeing their posts as a quick path to personal enrichment, colluded with tax farmers publicani to squeeze every last sestertius from the local populations. The peace and prosperity of Italy were directly subsidized by the systematic exploitation of the rest of the empire. Beneath this entire structure lay the bedrock of Roman society, chattel slavery. The vast agricultural estates, the latifundia, that replaced the small citizen farms of the old republic were industrial-scale operations that ran on slave labor. In the centuries of expansion, Roman wars had yielded a seemingly endless supply of human property. These were the people who performed the back-breaking work in the fields and the dangerous, life-shortening labor in the mines. The leisurely, philosophical lifestyle of a man like Pliny the Younger, with his multiple villas and intellectual pursuits, was made possible by the violent denial of freedom to thousands of human beings. This economic model hollowed out Roman society. The Italian peasantry, unable to compete with slave-run megafarms, flocked to the cities, becoming a volatile, landless proletariat dependent on state handouts, the famous bread and circuses. The gap between the fabulously wealthy elite and the impoverished masses, both slave and free, grew into an unbridgeable chasm. Imperial overstretch, the burdens of scale. For centuries, Rome's business model had been based on profitable expansion. Conquest brought new lands to tax, new mines to exploit, and new populations to enslave, providing the resources to fund the very legions that enabled the next wave of conquest. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of growth. But by the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, the empire had reached its practical limits. It bordered powerful, organized states like Parthia to the east, and vast, unurbanized wildernesses to the north. Further expansion offered diminishing returns at an ever-increasing cost. This is the moment an empire begins to suffer from what historian Paul Kennedy has termed imperial overstretch. The state's military and administrative commitments have become so vast that its economic base can no longer sustainably support them. The empire shifts from being a profitable growth enterprise to a mature company saddled with enormous fixed security costs. The primary function of the legions was no longer to conquer, but to garrison thousands of miles of static frontier. The army that had once paid for itself through plunder now became a permanent, ruinous drain on the treasury. This new reality fundamentally altered the nature of the Roman military and its relationship to the state. The legions were no longer citizen soldiers serving short campaigns and then returning to their farms. They were a permanent, professional force stationed for decades in the same frontier provinces. Their sons often followed them into service, creating a distinct military class. Over time, the loyalty of these soldiers naturally shifted. It moved away from the distant, abstract authority of the Senate in Rome and became intensely personal, focused on the general who led them into battle, secured bonuses for them, and shared the hardships of frontier life. This created a deadly political dynamic. The true master of Rome was not the man wearing the purple toga in the palace, but the man who commanded the loyalty of the largest number of legions. The state, in effect, became a hostage to its own army, a permanent military-political complex whose interests often superseded those of the civilian population. Case study: the crisis of the 3rd century. The system crashes. For a time, the genius of the adoptive emperor system, from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, masked this growing instability by producing a series of competent and respected rulers. But the underlying structural rot was there. The first terrifying glimpse of the system's fragility came much earlier, in 69 CE. Following Emperor Nero's suicide, the unspoken rules of succession were shattered. In the chaotic Year of the Four Emperors, multiple frontier generals were declared emperor by their own troops, who then marched on Rome to install their candidate on the throne. It was a catastrophic precedent, proving that ultimate power grew not from senatorial decree or noble blood, but from the tip of a spear on the Danube or the Rhine. This was the prologue. The full-blown system crash occurred in the 3rd century. Beginning with the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus in 235 CE, the empire plunged into a half-century of anarchy, civil war, and fragmentation known as the Crisis of the Third Century. It was not a series of unfortunate events or bad emperors. It was the logical and violent conclusion of the paradox of peace. In 50 years, more than 26 men, mostly powerful generals, claimed the title of emperor. They are known as the barracks emperors because they were made and unmade by the soldiers. An emperor's reign was often brutal, nasty, and short, ending the moment he could no longer satisfy his troops' demands for higher pay or was defeated in battle. The empire became the prize in a deadly, perpetual civil war. To fund the endless military bribes, emperors massively debased the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius to almost zero. This triggered runaway hyperinflation, destroying the wealth of the urban middle class and crippling the economy. With the legions busy fighting each other, the frontiers were left dangerously exposed. Germanic tribes like the Goths and Alemanni poured across the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into Roman territory. In the east, the newly aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire inflicted humiliating defeats on Roman armies, even capturing the Emperor Valerian alive. The central state became so weak that entire sections of the empire broke away to defend themselves, forming the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrian Empire in the east. The universal state celebrated by Aristides had fractured into three warring pieces. The crisis was the violent implosion of the Pax Romana. The military-political complex had turned inward, consuming its creator. The economic model based on extraction had failed. The sheer scale of the empire had made it ungovernable by the institutions that had created it. The Pax Romana was thus an age of profound and fatal contradiction. It was a period of internal peace maintained by external war, of urban splendor financed by rural exploitation, and of legal order built upon mass slavery. Its success in conquering the known world created a system so large and complex that it eventually collapsed under its own weight. The empire would survive this near-death experience, but only by being radically and brutally transformed. The crisis had burned away the last vestiges of the old republic. In its place, a new, more rigid, and more desperate form of empire would have to be born from the ashes. An empire can appear invincible at the very moment it is becoming hollow. Like a great oak, its bark can be thick and its branches wide, giving every impression of strength, while deep within its core, fungus and rot are steadily eating away at its heartwood. The crisis of the 3rd century was the storm that finally revealed the tree was hollow. The political chaos, the civil wars, and the fragmenting frontiers were not the disease itself, but the violent symptoms of deep-seated pathologies that had been festering for a century. To truly understand why the High Empire fell into such a catastrophic spiral, we must move beyond the narrative of emperors and battles and conduct a modern audit of the imperial system. We must look at the unseen pathogens that were spreading through the body politic long before the fever broke. There were three primary vectors of this internal decay, each feeding the others in a vicious cycle. Rome was being poisoned by its money, decimated by its plagues, and converted from its foundational soul. Part 1. The Poisoned Coin, Economic Decay. For centuries, the financial bedrock of the Mediterranean world was a small silver coin, the denarius. First minted during the Republic, its reliably high silver content made it the trusted currency of the empire, the ancient world's equivalent of the US dollar. It was a store of value and a universal medium of exchange that facilitated trade from Scotland to the Sahara. The coin's integrity was a tangible symbol of the state's own integrity. This trust began to be deliberately eroded by the state itself. The rot started subtly. Emperors like Nero, facing immense expenses for wars, building projects, and imperial largesse, resorted to a stealthy and insidious form of fraud. They began to debase the currency. At first, they simply reduced the coin's weight. Later, and more effectively, they began minting new denarii that looked identical to the old ones but contained less and less silver, replaced by cheaper base metals like copper. This was a hidden tax, a way for the state to pay its soldiers and contractors with money that was worth a fraction of its face value. This policy initiated a cascade of economic poison. The first effect was what is now known as Gresham's Law. Bad money drives out good. Citizens, realizing the new coins were intrinsically worthless, would hoard the old high-purity silver coins and pass the new debased ones into circulation as quickly as possible. The good money vanished, and the monetary system became flooded with junk currency. The second, more devastating effect was runaway inflation. As producers and merchants realized the coins they were receiving were worthless, they raised their prices to compensate. A soldier who received a bag of new denarii for his service would find that it bought half what it had the year before. The price of grain, oil, and livestock skyrocketed. This destroyed the savings of the middle class, impoverished anyone on a fixed income, and made rational, long-term economic planning impossible. Why invest in a business venture when the currency you'd be paid in might be worthless by year's end? The economic engine of the empire sputtered and seized. This was more than a financial crisis. It was a profound betrayal of the state's duty to its people. The government, the supposed guarantor of order and stability, had become the primary agent of economic chaos. By the height of the 3rd century crisis, the denarius contained almost no silver at all. It was a silver-washed piece of bronze, a perfect metaphor for an empire that maintained the outward form of its former glory, but had become rotten within. Part 2. The Empty Fields. Demographic and Environmental Crisis. In 1650 CE, the legions of Emperor Lucius Verus returned to Rome from a successful campaign against the Parthian Empire. They brought with them not just the spoils of war, but a far more terrible consequence of global connectivity. They carried the Antonine Plague. Believed by modern scholars to have been a virulent outbreak of smallpox or measles, this pandemic swept through the empire for 15 years, a biological firestorm raging along the very trade routes and military roads that were the source of Roman strength. The scale of the catastrophe is difficult to comprehend. Contemporary accounts describe cities choked with the dead, their bodies thrown into mass graves. Farms were abandoned, their owners dead or fled. Entire villages simply vanished from the map. Modern demographic estimates, though tentative, suggest the plague killed between 5 and 7 million people, or roughly 10% of the empire's total population. In the densest urban centers and army camps, the death rate may have been as high as 1/3. The emperor himself, the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius, is believed to have been one of its final victims in 180 CE. This was not merely a human tragedy. It was a systemic shock from which the empire never fully recovered. The plague dealt a crippling blow to Rome's two most critical resources, bodies and money. The decimation of the population created an acute labor shortage, crippling agricultural output and making it impossible to man the mines. The empire's economic production went into a steep decline. More critically, it decimated the ranks of the legions. To fill the depleted units, the army was forced to accelerate its recruitment of men from outside the empire, the Barbari. This was a short-term fix with long-term consequences for the culture and loyalty of the military. Simultaneously, the plague shattered the state's fiscal base. A smaller population meant fewer taxpayers. The government's revenue collapsed at the precise moment its military expenses were spiraling due to increased pressure on the frontiers. This fiscal crisis created a desperate feedback loop, putting immense pressure on emperors to debase the currency even further, thus pouring gasoline on the fire of inflation. The plague had broken the demographic and financial spine of the empire, leaving it brittle and vulnerable to the political shocks that were to come. It also inflicted a deep psychological wound, shattering the confident worldview of the Pax Romana. The traditional gods seemed powerless to stop the suffering, creating a spiritual vacuum and a pervasive sense of anxiety that the old order could no longer assuage. Part 3. The Fading Gods. Ideological Shift. The traditional religion of Rome was, at its heart, a public utility. It was a civic and contractual relationship between the Roman people and their gods. Through the meticulous performance of public rites and sacrifices, pietas, the Romans sought to maintain the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. This divine favor, in turn, was believed to guarantee the security, stability, and prosperity of the state. It was a religion of public duty, not private morality, of collective ritual, not personal salvation. Its ultimate goal was not to save an individual soul in the next world, but to secure the Roman state in this world. Into the anxious, plague-scarred, and economically shattered world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, this civic religion offered little comfort. This spiritual vacuum created a fertile ground for a new wave of belief systems flowing from the East, the mystery cults. The cults of Isis, Mithras, and Sol Invictus gained immense popularity by offering what the state religion could not: a personal, emotional connection to a deity, elaborate initiation rites, a sense of community, and, most importantly, the promise of salvation and a blessed afterlife. Among these, one faith proved to be the most resilient, the most organized, and ultimately the most revolutionary: Christianity. Its success was due to a unique combination of features. It offered a single, all-powerful God who was not a distant state functionary, but a loving, personal Savior. Its promise of resurrection and eternal life was a powerful antidote to the era's pervasive fear of death. But its true genius lay in its social organization. Christian communities functioned as self-sustaining support networks. They provided food for the poor, care for widows and orphans, and famously nursed their own sick during epidemics, a practice that likely resulted in higher survival rates and served as a powerful recruiting tool. In a vast, impersonal empire, the Church offered a real, tangible community: agape. From the perspective of the Roman state, this new faith was profoundly subversive. Its universal message, open to slave and noble, man and woman, Roman and barbarian, was not the problem. The issue was its exclusivity. Christians refused to participate in the public rituals that were seen as essential for maintaining the Pax Deorum. To refuse to offer a pinch of incense to the emperor's divine spirit was not just an act of religious dissent, it was an act of political treason. It was a rejection of the foundational ideology that bound the empire together. Christianity privatized morality, shifting the ultimate locus of loyalty from the state to God and from the emperor to the local bishop. It created a parallel society, an empire within an empire, with its own laws, its own leaders, and its own non-negotiable set of values. These three pathogens, a debased currency, a decimated population, and a dissenting ideology, were the true seeds of decay. They were not external attacks, but internal failures bred by the empire's own success. The globalized economy spread the plague, the state's fiscal needs drove the inflation, and the spiritual emptiness of the official cult created the market for a new faith. By the time Diocletian seized power in 284 CE, the Roman world was not just politically broken, it was financially, demographically, and spiritually bankrupt. The task ahead was not to repair the old system, but to build something entirely new on its ruins. When Diocletian, a Dalmatian general of humble birth, was acclaimed emperor by his troops in 284 CE, no one had reason to believe his reign would be different from the bloody, short-lived tenures of his predecessors. He was, by all appearances, just the latest man to win the imperial lottery, a ticket that was almost always a death sentence. But Diocletian was not just a soldier. He was a radical pragmatist, a man who looked upon the crisis-ridden empire not as something to be patched up, but as a condemned structure that needed to be demolished to its foundations to save the materials. The system he inherited, the Principate, the elegant, centuries-old facade of a republic ruled by a first citizen, was a fiction that had catastrophically failed. His reign, and that of his successor Constantine, would not be a restoration. It would be a revolution from the top, a controlled demolition of the old Rome to construct something harder, more brittle, and more capable of survival. Diocletian's revolution, the corporate restructuring. Diocletian's diagnosis of the empire's sickness was clear and brutal. The state was too large to be governed by a single man from a single capital. Its frontiers were too long and were under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Its politics were fatally destabilized by the ambitions of powerful generals who saw the throne as the ultimate prize. The old system was simply no longer fit for purpose. His solution was not to seek a return to a mythical past, but to impose a new, ruthlessly logical order. His most revolutionary act was the creation of the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. This was a radical corporate restructuring of the Roman enterprise. Diocletian, acting as a grim-faced CEO, effectively split the unwieldy global empire into four manageable administrative divisions. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, with the same senior rank of Augustus, taking the east for himself and giving Maximian the west. Then each Augustus adopted a junior emperor, a Caesar, who would serve as his deputy and designated heir. Galerius was appointed Caesar in the east and Constantius in the west. This was a brilliant solution to the twin problems of scale and succession. It decentralized the C-suite, allowing each tetrarch to govern from a strategic capital closer to the frontiers: Trier, Milan, Sirmium, Nicomedia, anywhere but the politically troublesome Old Rome. Now, if a crisis erupted on the Rhine, a Caesar could respond immediately, without the Augustus having to abandon the critical Persian frontier. It also attempted to solve the problem of usurpation by giving the most powerful generals a legitimate stake in the system and a clear, non-violent path to the top job. With this new structure came a new ideology. Diocletian understood that the authority of the emperor had been fatally weakened. It needed to be reforged. He systematically dismantled the last fictions of the Principate. The emperor was no longer the princeps, the first citizen. He was now the dominus, the lord, a remote, divine monarch elevated far above his subjects. This new system, the dominate, replaced the myth of the citizen emperor with the reality of an absolute autocrat. Diocletian adopted elaborate court ceremonials borrowed from the Sassanid Persians, historic enemies of Rome. Visitors now had to perform proskynesis, prostrating themselves fully on the ground before him. The emperor wore a diadem and robes of purple silk and gold, rarely appearing in public. This was not mere egomania. It was calculated political theater designed to make the emperor a sacred figure, to insulate him from the casual assassinations that had defined the previous 50 years. To kill the emperor was no longer just murder, it was sacrilege. This political overhaul was matched by an economic and administrative shock therapy. To better manage the empire and dilute the power of any one official, Diocletian doubled the number of provinces, making them smaller and grouping them into new administrative units called dioceses. Crucially, he separated civil and military authority within these provinces, a move designed to prevent ambitious governors from using their legions to make a bid for the throne. To feed and supply this larger, more complex state, he bypassed the worthless currency and imposed a new tax system, the annona, based on units of land and labor. Taxes were now levied directly in kind: grain, meat, oil, uniforms, ensuring the army and the new bureaucracy were supplied regardless of inflation. It was a return to a command economy, and to enforce it, Diocletian issued decrees that essentially froze society in place. Sons were forced to take up their father's trades. The tenant farmer, the colonus, was bound to his land. This was the beginning of the end of social mobility, a desperate measure to lock down a society in crisis. Constantine's completion, the new foundation. Diocletian's elegant plan for a peaceful succession of the Tetrarchy collapsed into a new round of civil wars almost as soon as he took the unprecedented step of voluntarily retiring in 305 CE. But while his specific mechanism failed, his core principles, a divided, multicentric, and autocratic empire, had permanently taken root. Out of the chaos of the subsequent civil wars emerged a figure as ruthless and visionary as Diocletian himself, Constantine. He did not reverse Diocletian's work, he completed it, building upon the new foundation to create the final form of the Roman state. Constantine's most enduring physical legacy was the founding of a new Rome on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. The creation of Constantinople was the ultimate act of corporate relocation. Its strategic brilliance was undeniable. Situated on a defensible peninsula controlling the Bosphorus Strait, the choke point between Europe and Asia, it was a fortress that could be supplied by sea, perfectly positioned to manage the empire's two most critical frontiers, the Danube and the Euphrates. But its ideological significance was even greater. Old Rome was a city of pagan temples, ancient senatorial families who resented their loss of power, and the ghosts of a republican past. Constantinople was a Christian capital from its inception, a blank slate free from the baggage of the old world. It was a definitive statement that the empire's center of gravity, politically, militarily, and spiritually, had shifted eastward forever. Constantine's most revolutionary act, however, was his complete reversal of imperial policy toward Christianity. Where Diocletian had launched the Great Persecution in a final bloody attempt to eradicate the faith, Constantine recognized its unstoppable momentum and chose to co-opt it. His famous battlefield vision of a cross before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge marks the pivotal moment when the Roman state began its alignment with the Church. Whether an act of genuine faith or shrewd political calculation, Constantine saw that Christianity offered a powerful new ideological glue to hold his reorganized empire together. He showered the church with tax exemptions, imperial funds, and legal privileges. He built magnificent basilicas in Constantinople, Rome, and the Holy Land. He convened the Council of Nicaea to hammer out a unified official doctrine, placing himself as the supreme arbiter of the faith. In one stroke, he transformed Christianity from a persecuted sect into a privileged partner of the state, harnessing its robust administrative structure of bishops and dioceses as a tool of imperial governance. Finally, where Diocletian's economic reforms had been a pragmatic but regressive step back toward a barter economy, Constantine provided the foundation for a new monetary future. He introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, minted at a consistent weight and purity. This stable currency halted the hyperinflationary spiral and became the trusted financial instrument of the Mediterranean for the next 700 years. It would become the bedrock of the surviving Eastern Empire's commercial power. The new empire. The state that emerged from the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine was, in all but name, a new empire. The Augustan Principate was gone. In its place stood the Dominate, an absolute monarchy legitimized by a new monotheistic faith. A small, elite Senate had been replaced by a vast, hierarchical bureaucracy. A partially free market had given way to a rigid command economy. An emperor, who was theoretically the first among equals, had been replaced by a sacred and remote lord. This great reorganization saved the Roman state from immediate dissolution. It created a more defensible, administratively robust, and ideologically unified system that was capable of weathering the storms to come. But this survival came at the immense cost of individual liberty and the final suppression of the classical ideal of the citizen. The late Roman Empire was a harder, more defensive, and more oppressive world. It was a garrison state, braced for a permanent siege. Crucially, the reorganization sealed the divergent fates of the empire's two halves. By establishing a new, easily defended capital in the east and concentrating resources there, it gave the wealthier and more urbanized eastern provinces the tools to survive for another millennium as the Byzantine Empire. The west, poorer and facing longer, more porous frontiers, was left with a system that was too expensive, too rigid, and too brittle to withstand the immense pressures that were about to fall upon it. The controlled demolition had shored up the foundations of the eastern half of the structure, but in doing so, it all but guaranteed the eventual collapse of the West. The year 476 CE holds a magnetic power in the Western imagination. It is the date etched into history as the end of the world's greatest empire. The event itself seems deceptively simple. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, leading a revolt of Roman army troops, deposed the last Western Roman Empire, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus. In that moment, the narrative goes, the light of Rome was extinguished, and the Dark Ages began. This dramatic image of a sudden, cataclysmic fall is powerful, simple, and almost entirely wrong. For the vast majority of people living in what was once the Western Empire, the events of 476 were a distant political footnote, a bureaucratic reshuffling in a far-off Italian court that had long ceased to be relevant to their lives. The Roman Empire in the West did not fall with a thunderous crash. It had been fading for a century, its authority slowly and quietly dissolving, like a coastline under a rising tide. The real story of the fall is not one of fiery conquest, but of a slow, pragmatic, and widespread disengagement. Rome wasn't destroyed, it simply ceased to be worth the cost. The theory of collapse, when complexity becomes the problem. The traditional barbarians at the gates narrative is a deeply flawed explanation for Rome's demise. It mistakes the symptom for the disease. Germanic peoples had been interacting with, migrating into, and serving within the Roman Empire for centuries. The critical question isn't why the barbarians came, but why the sophisticated Roman system, which had successfully managed such pressures for generations, was no longer able to absorb or repel them. The most compelling answer comes from the work of anthropologist Joseph Tainter, who proposed a powerful model for societal collapse. Tainter argues that societies evolve greater complexity, larger bureaucracies, more advanced technology, more stratified social structures, in order to solve problems. Initially, these investments in complexity yield high returns. Building an aqueduct, for example, is a complex undertaking that provides enormous benefits in public health and sanitation. Over time, however, societies tend to reach a point of diminishing marginal returns. Each new investment in complexity generates less and less benefit. Adding another layer of imperial bureaucracy, for instance, might increase costs exponentially while only marginally improving administrative efficiency. Eventually, a society can reach a terminal stage where the cost of maintaining its existing level of complexity becomes an unbearable burden. The elaborate systems that once solved problems have now become the problem itself. At this point, Tainter argues, collapse can become a rational, if unintentional, choice. People begin to disengage from the central state, reverting to simpler, more local, and less costly forms of organization. The late Western Roman Empire is the quintessential example of this process. The hyper-complex military and administrative state created by Diocletian and Constantine was a brilliant short-term solution to the crisis of the 3rd century, but it was ruinously expensive. The crushing tax burden required to support the massive army and sprawling bureaucracy was strangling the very economy it was supposed to protect. For a farmer in Gaul or a landowner in Spain, the Roman state was no longer a provider of law, security, and infrastructure. It had become a predatory and remote entity, an engine of extraction whose demands far outweighed any benefits it offered. The Great Disengagement, the privatization of power. To understand this process on a human level, we need only look at the life and letters of Sidonius Apollinaris, a 5th century Gallo-Roman nobleman, poet, and later bishop. His life story is a perfect chronicle of the transition from a Roman world to a medieval one. In his early letters, Sidonius lives a life of refined Roman leisure at his villa near modern-day Clermont-Ferrand. He writes in elegant, classicizing Latin about literature, philosophy, and the genteel pursuits of his aristocratic circle. He plays a Roman form of tennis, enjoys the heated baths his ancestors had built, and gossips about imperial politics. But the cracks in his world are showing. He complains that the imperial post has become unreliable, a sign that the great infrastructure of the state is failing. He notes the uncouth manners of the Burgundian Federati, allied Germanic troops settled on Roman lands, who are his powerful new neighbors. He is a man clinging to the culture of Rome while the state that guaranteed it is dissolving around him. The critical pressure point was the tax system. When the imperial tax collector arrived at Sidonius's estate, he was not seen as an agent of civic order, but as a threat. The ruinous taxes were demanded to fund a distant court in Ravenna and its endless political intrigues, not to repair the local bridge or pay for a legion to protect the region from raiders. Sidonius saw his own tenant farmers abandoning their plots, preferring to live under the authority of a local Germanic chieftain whose form of taxation, a simple tribute of grain and cattle, was far less burdensome than the complex and predatory Roman system. This was the moment of disengagement, the rational choice to opt out of a state that had become too costly. The final stage came when the Visigoths laid siege to his city. By this time, Sidonius had become its bishop, a role that was increasingly political as secular authority waned. He looked for help from the Roman state, but no imperial army was coming. The state had failed in its most fundamental duty, to provide security for its citizens. It fell to Sidonius, the bishop, to organize the defense of the city and, ultimately, to negotiate the terms of its surrender to the Visigothic king. In that moment, the transition was complete. Sidonius the Roman aristocrat had become Sidonius the medieval lord. He had, by necessity, taken over the localized functions of diplomacy, leadership, and governance because the central state had become a vacuum. This story was repeated all across the West. Power was not so much conquered as it was privatized. Local strongmen, both Roman landowners and Germanic military leaders, stepped in to fill the void left by an irrelevant central government, creating a patchwork of localized successor kingdoms. The end of the West, a whimper, not a bang. By the 470s, the position of Western Roman emperor had become a tragic farce. He was a powerless puppet, controlled by a series of Germanic generals who held the real military power in Italy and held the title Magister Militum, or Master of Soldiers. The emperor controlled almost no territory outside of Italy itself. The fatal blow had come decades earlier, in the 430s, when the Vandals had seized the rich provinces of North Africa, cutting off the grain supply and the tax revenue that was the lifeblood of the Western court. This is the context for 476. The barbarian Odoacer was a high-ranking officer in the Roman army, a force by then composed almost entirely of Germanic troops. His revolt was essentially a labor dispute. The troops demanded permanent land grants in Italy, similar to what other foederati had received elsewhere in the empire. When the emperor's father and regent, Orestes, refused, the army acclaimed Odoacer as their leader, who then captured and executed Orestes and deposed the boy emperor Romulus. But what Odoacer did next is the most telling detail in the entire story. He did not declare himself the first king of a new barbarian kingdom of Italy. He did something far more pragmatic. He carefully gathered the imperial insignia of the West, the diadem, the purple robes, the scepter, and sent them as a formal diplomatic package to the remaining Roman emperor, Zeno, in Constantinople. The accompanying message was a formal recognition of reality. The West, it said in essence, no longer requires an emperor of its own. Your single majesty is sufficient for both ends of the empire. Odoacer then requested that Zeno recognize him as a Roman patrician, ruling Italy as the Eastern Emperor's nominal viceroy. This was not an act of destruction. It was an act of corporate downsizing. It was a formal declaration that the Western imperial office was an expensive redundancy that the system could no longer afford. The charade of a separate Western emperor, which had offered no value for decades, was simply ended. The Western Roman Empire, therefore, did not fall. It was dismantled. It dissolved under the weight of its own suffocating complexity. Its citizens, finding the costs of the imperial system to be unbearable, gradually withdrew their support and transferred their allegiance to more local, effective, and affordable forms of power. The year 476 was not a violent conquest, but the quiet administrative end to a long, slow sunset. The central fire of Roman authority, having dwindled for a century, finally went out. But the ghost of its civilization, its law, its language, its religion, and its very idea would continue to haunt and shape the new world that was just beginning to emerge from its twilight. Conclusion: the ghost in the machine. In 476 CE, a Germanic soldier serving in the Roman army sent a package of clothes and jewels from Italy to the Roman emperor in Constantinople. This simple act, the shipping of the Western imperial regalia to the East, was a quiet, bureaucratic admission that the political entity known as the Western Roman Empire had ceased to be a going concern. But an empire is more than a political structure. It is a system of ideas, a form of cultural software installed in the minds of millions. And while the hardware of the Western state had failed, the operating system of Roman civilization was too deeply embedded to be uninstalled. The fall of Rome was not an ending. It was a transformation. The moment the physical empire died, and its far more powerful ghost was born. That ghost, the persistent, powerful, and often perilous idea of Rome, has haunted the world ever since. Its legacy is not truly in the marbled ruins of the Forum or the elegant arches of its aqueducts. Those are merely the physical artifacts. The true ghost of Rome is the memory of a universal state, the grand and ambitious dream of a world brought together under a single system of law, order, and civilization. It is this idea, this ghost in the machine of Western history, that has proven to be Rome's most enduring and influential creation. The life cycle as archetype. Looking back, the long arc of Roman history reveals more than just a unique story. It reveals an archetypal life cycle, a predictive model for how great powers are born, how they mature, and why they inevitably fail. It is a pattern that has echoed through the centuries. It begins with the startup phase, a small, aggressive, and highly motivated society on the periphery harnesses a unique cultural and social model, in Rome's case, the business model of military assimilation, to achieve a stunningly rapid and high-risk expansion. It then enters a growth and monopoly phase, developing its killer apps, for Rome, the relentless engineering of the legions and the scalable software of the law, to consolidate its gains and create a resilient, integrated, and world-spanning system. This success leads inevitably to the maturity phase and the paradox of success. The system reaches a scale where its own complexity becomes a burden. The immense costs of administration and defense begin to outweigh the benefits of expansion. Internal contradictions, papered over during the growth phase, in Rome's case, systemic inequality, dependence on slavery, and the exploitation of its provinces, begin to fester. This is the moment the unseen seeds of decay begin to sprout. Financial rot from currency debasement, demographic shocks from plague and environmental strain, and ideological challenges from new faiths all weaken the system from within. Faced with a near-fatal crisis, the state enters a period of radical restructuring. A new generation of ruthless leaders imposes a more rigid, autocratic, and centralized system, the dominant, as a desperate attempt to manage the decline. They perform a controlled demolition of the old order, prolonging the state's life, but at the cost of its founding values. Finally, the system enters the last stage, dissolution. The central state becomes so expensive and predatory that its benefits are no longer worth the cost. Citizens and local elites begin a great disengagement, transferring their loyalty to more effective and affordable local forms of power. The empire doesn't so much fall as it is slowly and rationally dismantled from below. This life cycle is Rome's story, but it is not Rome's alone. It provides a chillingly familiar blueprint for analyzing the trajectory of the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire. Rome is the master case study, the foundational text for understanding the birth, life, and death of complex societies. Rome's afterlife, the dream of universalism. For 1,000 years after the last Western emperor was pensioned off, European civilization was obsessed with the ghost of Rome. The dream of resurrecting its universal order became the central project of the medieval and early modern world. The Roman Catholic Church was the first and most successful entity to claim its mantle. It preserved the ghost, adopting Rome's administrative structure of dioceses, its official language of Latin, and its sophisticated legal traditions in the form of canon law. The Pope, headquartered in Rome, even took the ancient imperial title of Pontifex Maximus. The Church became the spiritual successor to the Western Empire, a transnational institution that sought to bind Christendom together. Secular rulers were no less enthralled. When Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in 800 CE, it was a conscious and powerful attempt to reboot the imperial project. The Holy Roman Empire that followed was a 1,000-year testament to the enduring power of the Roman idea, a refusal to accept that a unified Christian Roman imperium in the West was gone forever. From the Renaissance, which was fueled by the rediscovery of Roman texts, to the Enlightenment, where the founders of the American Republic obsessed over the lessons of the Roman Republic, the ghost remained a constant presence, a source of inspiration and a dire warning. Even the great colonial powers of the 19th century saw themselves as the new Romans, shouldering the burden of bringing law, infrastructure, and civilization to the world. Their district commissioners acting as modern-day proconsuls. The Roman moment. This brings us to our own time. The story of Rome is not a dead history. It is a living, cautionary tale. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the vast, complex, and interconnected global system we have built. Are we, too, living in a Roman moment? We live in a world with its own universalist ideals of human rights and democracy, its own common language of commerce and science, and its own integrated economic system. It is a world underwritten by a dominant military power that projects force across the globe to maintain a form of Pax Americana. But, as we have seen, success breeds its own paradoxes. Are we now facing the diminishing returns of our own complexity, with sprawling international bureaucracies that struggle to solve problems effectively? Are we feeling the strain of imperial overstretch, with military and security commitments that our economies can no longer so easily sustain? Are we witnessing a deep loss of faith in our own central institutions, a rise in political polarization, and the emergence of new, competing ideologies that challenge the very foundations of our post-war order? Are we seeing the same patterns of extreme inequality and social stratification that hollowed out the Roman middle class? The final and perhaps most important lesson that the ghost of Rome teaches us is this: the most dangerous threats to a complex society rarely come from invading forces at the gate. They are almost always born from within, from the slow, creeping decay of political norms, from the betrayal of economic trust, and from the loss of a shared sense of purpose. Rome's story is a 2,000-year-old mirror, and in it, if we are brave enough to look, we might just see a reflection of ourselves.